So we're picking up in our chapter 24 notes with middle class culture and values. So interestingly, the largest item in the household budget of a middle class family was food. Middle class people like to eat well, and their favorite social occasion was a dinner party. So middle class wives coped with the endless procession of meals, courses, and dishes because she had the money to pay for that, and because she had servants at her disposal. So employing a full-time maid not only helped her to deal with the procession of meals, but also was a sign that the family had crossed a cultural divide that separated them from the working classes. Many of the prosperous families rented rather than owned their homes, and some of them purchased country places or built beach houses for the weekend and summer use. The factory, the sewing machine, and the department store all helped to reduce the costs and to expand the variety of clothing for the fashion-conscious middle-class women. Rich businessmen typically devoted less time to business and more time to travel and books and music than was the case in less wealthy families. But in addition to their material tastes, the middle classes agreed upon a strict code of behavior and morality that stressed hard work, self-discipline, and personal achievement. The middle class person was supposed to know right from wrong and was expected to act accordingly. The people and occupations of the working class. So at the turn of the 20th century, about 4 out of 5 people were working class members. That is, people whose livelihood depended on physical labor. So there's a wide range of people here. The specialization is more diverse than even the middle class. They were less unified and homogeneous than the middle class. And they range between skilled workers, semi-skilled workers, and completely unskilled workers. And they developed widely different lifestyles and cultural values. And their differences did contribute to a keen sense of social status and hierarchy, even just within the working class. So you have the highly skilled workers at the top, and this would be like the construction bosses, factory foremen, cabinet makers, jewelers, printers, and they became known as like the labor aristocracy because they were at the top of the working class. And this was about 15% of the working class, and they valued self-discipline, stern morality, sort of like the middle class did, and they were strongly committed to family and to economic improvement. Below the labor aristocracy was an enormously complex sector that was made up both of unskilled and semi-skilled urban workers. Workers in the established crafts stood near the top of the semi-skilled hierarchy, while a large number of semi-skilled workers were actually factory workers. And many of them were unmarried women who earned different but relatively good wages. So that was good for the women. And then below them was a group of unskilled workers. And this included day laborers. They were unorganized, they were divided, and they were united only by one thing, and that was that they received meager earnings. But one of the largest components of the unskilled group was the domestic servant segment, and the great majority of those were women. In fact, in Britain, 1 out of every 3 girls was a domestic servant between the ages of 15 and 20. So domestic service was hard work. They received low pay with limited independence, and of course, we've seen in chapter 20 the danger of sexual exploitation. Domestic service did have some real attractions for country girls with few skills, such as better or at least more varied marriage prospects and better wages than they would have received doing hard agricultural work. But many women did work during this time, and many of the working class wives had to join the ranks of those women in the sweated industries. And most of the time they worked at home, and most of the time they were paid by the piece that they produced, not necessarily by the hour. And then some women decorated dishes or embroidered linens. They did laundry, washing and ironing clothing, but the majority of them made clothing. The urban working classes sought fun and recreation, and their favorite leisure time activity, hands down, was drinking, which led to heavy drinking, which became a problem. But the heavy drinking problem did begin to decline around the 1890s, which reflects the moral leadership of the upper working class. At the same time, drinking became more publicly acceptable. Cafes and pubs sort of became like the hub for both moderate and radical working class political activities. Social drinking in public places by married couples and those who were dating also became more accepted. And this greater participation by women undoubtedly helped civilize the world of hard liquor and drinking. Cruel sports like bull baiting and cockfighting declined and were replaced by commercialized spectator sports like racing and soccer. The middle classes had operas and classical theaters, while the urban working classes had music halls and vaudeville theaters. As far as religion is concerned, it did continue to provide working people with meaning and solace, and we know that because of the rise of the German Pietism movement and English Methodism, which carried over into the 19th century. But there was a considerable decline in both church attendance and church donations, and this was true of most European countries, especially among the urban working classes. And partly this was because both Catholic and Protestant churches were viewed as conservative institutions who defended social order and tradition and custom. Therefore, they were political opponents to the European working classes. In the United States, this pattern differed because the working class people identified individual churches with particular ethnic groups and not necessarily with political or social status quo. And the same did occur in Europe if the church or synagogue had not been linked with a state. Like in Ireland, Catholicism still thrived, and in Russia, Jewish synagogues proliferated because they weren't seen as political or social institutions that were funded by the state. They were more tagged with certain ethnic groups. The changing family, and we're starting with premarital sex and marriage. Couples starting around 1850 began to go more with romantic sentiment than the tradition and financial considerations that influenced the pre-industrial marriages. So couples were relatively the same age, and many of them came from different or even distant towns because, well, they fell in love. So economic considerations did begin to decline among the middle classes after 1850, but marriage was still, for many families, one of life's most crucial financial transactions. And a young woman from the middle class found her romantic life very carefully supervised by her mother, who was undoubtedly well-meaning, but she schemed a proper marriage for her daughter and guarded her daughter's virginity like it was the family's credit. And middle-class boys were watched too, but usually by the time they had reached adolescence or late adolescence, they had obtained some considerable sexual experience, either with prostitutes or with maids. The illegitimacy explosion that began around 1750 did continue through the 1840s, but was eventually reversed in the second half of the 19th century as more babies were born to married mothers. Some people argued that the growth of Puritanism had lessened sexual permissiveness among the unmarried, but still, as many as 1 in 3 women were going to the altar pregnant. So technically they were married when the baby was born. Moreover, unmarried people did use affordable protection that had been brought about by the industrial age, such as condoms and diaphragms, and they were made available to prevent pregnancy, at least in predominantly Protestant countries. And in the later 19th century, pregnancy for a young single woman led increasingly to marriage and the establishment of a 2-parent household. And if you remember back to chapter 20, we said a lot of times these single women in this position would be left at the altar. But starting around 1850, the men carried through on their commitments there. And this just reflected the growing respectability of the working classes, as well as their very gradual economic improvement. So the growing stability of the urban working class couple strengthened the family as an institution. So prostitution was still practiced throughout the 1800s and into the 1900s. Sexual activity certainly existed outside of committed relationships and sometimes inside committed relationships, but men of all classes visited prostitutes. Many of the middle-class men did stick with their publicly professed code of Puritan morality. We talked about that a little bit before, how they had, a stern code of ethics, and many of them did stick to that, but others indulged their sexual appetites for prostitutes and promiscuity. For many poor young women during this time, prostitution, like domestic service, was just a stage of life, and it wasn't meant to be permanent employment. And after having done this for a while, many of them went on to marry and have families themselves. So, kinship ties. Within working class homes, ties to relatives after marriage were generally pretty strong and were more important than ties to unrelated acquaintances. People turned to their families for help whenever they were coping with sickness or death or unemployment and even old age. Members of large family groups often lived in the same neighborhood, and they would share Sunday dinners. They would pass down clothing that had been outgrown by the children, and talk about politics or whatever was going on during the time. So kinship ties were relatively strong. So that brings us to gender roles and early feminism. So after 1850, the work of most wives became increasingly distinct and separate from that of their husbands. Husbands were typically the wage earners working in a factory or an office, while women, or the wives, tended to stay home and manage the household, and of course care for the children. The societal ideal in 19th century Europe became a very strict division of labor by gender and rigidly constructed these separate spheres. Married women who wanted to or needed to move in the man's world of paid employment faced great obstacles. Well-paying jobs were pretty much off limits. Women's wages were almost always less than men's. Married women, of course, were subordinated to their husbands by law and lacked many basic legal rights. So, with all women facing discrimination in education and employment, and with middle-class women suffering especially from a lack of legal rights, you begin to see rebellion. And so organizations were founded by middle-class feminists, and they campaigned for equal legal rights for women, and they argued that unmarried women and middle-class widows that didn't make enough money needed more opportunities in order to support themselves. These organizations were able to score some significant victories. In 1882, a law was passed giving English married women full property rights. Women also very gradually began to find professional and white-collar employment, but progress was really slow on that. So middle-class feminists increasingly focused their attention on political action, and they fought for the right to vote for women. And there were even those who took it further, socialist women leaders who argued that the liberation of the working class women would come only with the liberation of the entire working class through violent revolution. And so we're going to leave off there, and we'll pick up with the importance of homemaking tomorrow.